Hello, welcome to CSC 239, Cyber Law and Ethics. Today we're going to be talking about ethical constraints and frameworks and how they can potentially relate to the internet and technology as a whole. So let's start off with defining ethics. The study of ethics and philosophy teaches us different ways, aka methods, to analyze moral dilemmas and social problems. So the first part of this presentation is an overview of the traditional philosophical frameworks. So when we talk about a philosophy or an ethical construction, the idea here is that you have a system of decision making that you believe is moral or ethical, or that allows you to feel good about the decisions you make. So we're going to define a few vocabulary words so that everybody's on the same page. First thing we're going to talk about are ethical norms. These are standards that distinguishes between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Most people learn ethical norms at home, at school, in church, or in other social settings. So when mom or dad tell you not to hit your little brother or little sister, that's kind of an ethical norm they're putting in place. You learn what's right and what's wrong during childhood. Moral development, however, occurs throughout life, especially as we personally face dilemmas. So before you're actually in a scenario, you think you might do X, Y, and Z. But once you're actually faced with that circumstance, you may realize that the stakes are much different than you had anticipated, and as such, you might make a different decision than you would have thought you would have, because the stakes are misaligned in your assumption, and in reality you realize what's really important. Ethical norms are so ubiquitous that one might be tempted to regard them as simply common sense. On the one hand, if morality were nothing more than common sense, then why are there so many ethical disputes and issues in our society? So in the same way that someone may believe that healthcare for children should be mandated and mandatory, someone else might say no, because this is how we weed out the poor, by letting them just get sick and die. So even though morality may not sound like a moral decision to make a decision like that, there are moralities or ethical systems that do encourage that kind of personal selfish behavior, and we're going to talk about some of those. Cultural norms are the rules that govern social behavior. So what is normal in one country may not be normal in another. So for example, women in Saudi Arabia are expected to always wear a burqa when they are in public. They can't show any flesh. In the United States, we don't always accept that as something that is good for women. The ethics rely on what we call meta-norms. These are universal guidelines that tell people to punish transgressors of norms. So for example, corruption must be punished. So a cop, government official, they are corrupt, they get caught, they go to jail, they pay a huge fine, and what basically society is doing is saying to other police officers, government officials, or anyone involved in corruption that you can't do this because it's against the cultural norm. And as such, we won't allow you to do it because everyone else will start to do it then. So what is the point of norms? Philosophically, the idea of societal norms allows man and womankind to flourish and achieve our full potential. And this is an idea that's almost as old as civilization itself, is that our job as humans is to be as impressive as possible in our own little world. Think of it as a race where everyone starts at the same spot, But if we don't have the norms, you have one runner who starts 20 feet ahead, another runner who starts 20 feet behind. So, what we're trying to do is keep things fair so that people can all have the opportunity to flourish. Do norms work? Yes, mostly. But there are always people who want to undermine the rules to achieve their goals without the thought to the needs of others. And again, we're going to be talking about some of these ethical situations where people will put themselves before others because that is their philosophy. So the idea of a norm is an unwritten rule that we all kind of just follow because that's what we've been trained to do by our mom and dad, our teachers, and everybody else involved in our upbringing. So, as I mentioned before, we're looking at ethical frameworks and how they relate to the internet. Now, interestingly, the internet is in itself a paradox. On the one hand, it empowers people and gives them an opportunity to exercise free speech. However, that same technology that made the internet available and viable is also being used to control those rights. For example, blocking software. A lot of us may have software on our laptops or phones which may prevent our 7-year-old from looking at naked pictures of boobies. We have developed constraints to our free speech. But then the question is, do we want our 7-year-old looking at naked pictures of boobies? Which is not a big deal, but if it's then, the more hardcore pornography, then we get a little more concerned. So, as we talk about each of these ideas, think about how it would impact your decision making in terms of the internet. So there's a concept called master principle of morality. These are the choices that should always be open to the fulfillment of persons and communities. Examples of good uses of regulatory codes: blocking software to prevent young children from seeing pornography. Other positive uses is preventing people from posting child pornography online. These kinds of things are meant to protect the most vulnerable of populations. The ultimate human good would be humans flourishing, and this idea is absolutely vital to the entire concept of what humans are on Earth for. And this should define the basis for how we create laws, develop social institutions, and regulate the internet. One of the terms that you'll hear periodically is eudaimonia, which is a noun that means human flourishing, a contented state of being, happiness, healthiness, prosperity. So the idea of giving somebody the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in other words. So we're going to look at these specific ethical philosophies: utilitarianism, social contract theory, pluralism, also known as categorical imperative, virtue ethics, ethical egoism, new natural law, and situational ethics. So we're going to start off with utilitarianism, which is not by far the oldest of the philosophical areas we're looking at, but it's certainly been established for a couple hundred years now. It was developed by Jeremy Bentham in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and that's the handsome fella on the top picture. Interestingly about Jeremy Bentham, when he died, he had his body embalmed, and he has been on display at a university in England ever since. So you can go look at his corpse and say hi. The other person is John Stuart Mill, who later took the concept that Bentham developed and expounded on it. And that's the handsome fella on the bottom with the great hair. Utilitarianism believes that the purpose of morality is to make life better by increasing the amount of good things, such as pleasure and happiness, in the world, and decreasing the amount of bad things, such as pain and unhappiness in the world. So if you think of happiness as a positive number and unhappiness or distress as a negative number, you want the highest possible positive number as can be achieved by society. And so the philosophy or the framework for utilitarianism is the best action is one that has the greatest possible balance of good over bad for the greatest number of people. Bentham and Mill said that no action is good or evil in and of itself, but the results of those actions are the only things that matter. So if you are thinking of should we legalize something like medical marijuana? Well, will it benefit people? Yes. Will it benefit sick people? Yes. Will it take that negative number and turn it into a positive? Yes. So from a utilitarian perspective, you could say that it would be a moral choice to legalize it. The downside, however, is what happens when human rights conflict with utility. For example, several years ago, the NSA was found to be accessing our online information to monitor all United States citizens for possible terrorist activity. So the question is, should we, as humans, have our rights suppressed for the common good, or i.e. security? And this theory lacks sensitivity to the ideas of justice and human rights. So just kind of bring it to a much more micro-centered example. Imagine a married man on a business trip in a distant town. He meets a woman who is also married, and they also live far away. They instantly feel a lustful attraction to each other. Knowing they'll never be found out, they embark on a passionate affair for the 3 days that they're together. According to utilitarian ethics, they have not done anything wrong. On the contrary, it would be morally wrong for them to not sleep together because they would be denying each other pleasure. So the idea here is not always the most quote-unquote moral choice, but the choice that is the best for society. Next, we're moving into social contract philosophy, which is really something that we all kind of engage in and we don't realize what we're doing. It examines moral issues from the perspective of the human rights that may be at stake. A right is something a population is entitled to. The consequences of an action are morally irrelevant, as opposed to utilitarianism. A negative right is one is free from external interference in one's affairs, so right for privacy. A positive right, one must be provided with something to pursue one's legitimate interests, and for example, the most common one in this country is public education. The philosophers John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Rawls believe we have basic rights because of an implicit social contract between the individual and civilized society. And what they believe is that we are guaranteed certain rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in exchange for following the laws and regulations of society. And this is a very strong perspective in the United States because Rousseau and John Locke, much of their writing led to the development of the Declaration of Independence by the United States. So what we're looking at here is we're going to follow the rules. We're going to stop at stop signs. We're going to follow the speed limit within reason. And in exchange, we're not going to be hassled by the cops or any other legal institution. The idea is muddied by race, gender, and all the other issues that we deal with in modern life, but that's the basic concept. The answers are always not so clear-cut in the cyber world. So, for example, the person who sends spam claims that they're exercising their free speech, but the person who receives the spam can claim that their right of privacy is being trespassed against. The problem lies in how this is addressed by the judicial powers, which shows that there is no easy answers. And we're going to talk about some of the judicial cases that have emerged over the last 20, 30 years about how we manage internet communications. The issues are not easy, and that's why with these dilemmas, you always need a framework or a structure in which to make your decisions that you feel comfortable with. So moving on to pluralism, otherwise known as moral duty or the categorical imperative. And this is based on the philosophy and writings of Immanuel Kant. One should always strive to identify and carry out one's moral duty. Consequences of an action are morally irrelevant, and the results from our actions can never be taken into consideration. Moral worth is defined by duty. According to Kant, our moral duty is defined by a rational moral law that is universal. So, for example, you find a credit card on the street, and instead of using it at your local electronics store, where you would engage in fraud, you turn it into the police. And again, the maxim here is stealing is wrong. So, as I mentioned, it's always also known as categorical imperative, the obligation to do one's duty for its own sake and not in pursuit of further ends, no exceptions. This imperative is true at all times and in all situations. So, if you think about it from a superhero perspective, Superman kind of has this categorical imperative. He fights for truth, justice, and the American way. Whereas a character like Batman, he doesn't always follow the rules. He doesn't always do the moral thing. So, in terms of thinking of these various philosophies as superheroes, you could apply exactly that concept to each of these philosophies, and that might help you remember things a little bit better. Kant believed that we had perfect duties we are obliged to always follow, such as telling the truth and keeping a promise. It is similar to the principle of fair play. We should never make exceptions for our own gain. So, our responsibility to the moral truth and the moral duty is more important to whatever, universal gains that are taken into account by not following one's moral imperative. So let's go back to that universal maxim of stealing is wrong. If we apply this to intellectual property rights, we download music or a movie illegally because everybody does it. However, this action is self-defeating because it leads to the destruction of the entire practice of intellectual property protection. Therefore, it is an immoral action. When we make exceptions for ourselves, we are committing an immoral act. So, what I want you to kind of consider is, we download a movie for free. We watch it. We know that all of our friends have downloaded it for free and watched it, and we just go on with our day. But look at it from a larger perspective. The movie production company spent a lot of money to make the movie, market the movie. They have not received any benefit from you, because even though you enjoyed the movie, you didn't pay for it. At some point, that production company is not going to have any more money to make movies. And as a consequence, your favorite movie director is then out of a job, and you wonder why. And, it sounds kind of like I'm this old lady grumbling about newfangled things, but the reality is they have to find new ways of changing the marketplace. And we saw this with music. Back in the day, you used to go to the store, you'd buy an album or a cassette or eventually a CD. Now we just download it, and most young people download them for free because they can. Instead of musicians making a ton of money off of sales of CDs, or downloads. Now they go out on concert tours and each ticket is $200. And that's a ridiculous amount of money to spend for 2 hours, but we do because we want to see our favorite acts. The reason they charge so much is because that's where they make their money now. So they change their business model. And for some people it's great, and other people who go to concerts, they are really bummed out how much it costs to go see a concert. So there you have my sad tale of woe about concert going. So what are our limitations to pluralism? It is accepted that Kant's philosophy is almost too rigid because it doesn't allow for acting towards the greater good. For example, we know it is wrong to lie, but what if lying could save someone's life? According to Kant, this is still immoral. William D. Ross, the handsome fella on the right, attempted to soften Kant's inflexibility by proposing that our duties are conditional, not absolute. His point is that when duties conflict with one another, one duty can supersede another duty if it is judged to be superior. He emphasizes that one duty cannot be overridden for selfish purposes. And so he's kind of, what Ross is doing is really blending the idea of pluralism and utilitarianism to soften Immanuel Kant's perspective. So let's move on to probably the oldest of all the philosophies. This is called virtue ethics, and this ethical framework emphasizes a person's character and their ability to foster certain virtues, as well as having what's called practical wisdom. It was originally developed by Aristotle, who learned a lot of these concepts from Plato. And this is about 350 years before Christ. And he focused on specific virtues that he felt led people to make good ethical choices. The virtues he spread included bravery and generosity. Sounds great. Modern day virtue ethics have evolved into three specific aspects. Eudaimonism, which we talked about a few slides back, which is human flourishing, is equated with performing one's distinctive function well, being the best you can be. This is a Platonic or Plato concept. Plato believed that there was what he called the Platonic ideal, that there was a perfect version of each of us that existed in another dimension, or at least that's his concept, and that our job on earth is to achieve the highest level of flourishing or achievement that we can achieve. And I did use achieve 3 times in a row. Agent-based theories emphasize the virtues are determined by common sense intuition that we judge to be admirable traits in other people. So we look at somebody and we admire their bravery, we admire their willingness to sacrifice themselves. Whatever we perceive as a society that are admirable traits become the virtues that we admire. Ethics of care, which was proposed by feminist thinkers who challenged the idea that ethics should focus solely on justice and bravery. It argues that more feminine traits, such as caring, nurturing, should also be considered. So, we all know that for the past 4,000, 5,000 years, men pretty much ran the show. It wasn't until the 20th century that women started to have some influence. And what they're saying is, we can all appreciate various ethical issues and virtues, but let's look at some of the virtues women bring to the table that really benefit society. So, some of the limitations of virtue ethics: for different people, cultures, and societies often have vastly different opinions of what constitutes a virtue. So, in the United States, a virtue that we would hold very highly is independence. And if you go to a Eastern country like China, independence is not seen as a virtue. Rather, a collective responsibility to society is considered a virtue. Also, it does not focus on what sorts of actions are morally permitted and which ones are not, but rather on what sort of qualities someone ought to foster in order to become a good person. This is a comic called Calvin and Hobbes, and both characters are named after famous philosophers, John Calvin and Hobbes. Can't remember his first name right now, but this is just priceless. So first cartoon block, the tiger says to the little boy, "How are you doing on your New Year's resolutions?" The little boy says, "I didn't make any." See, in order to improve oneself, one must have some idea of what's good that implies certain values. But as we all know, values are relative. Every system of belief is equally valid, and we need to tolerate diversity, and virtue isn't better than vice. It's just different. And the tiger said, "I don't know if I can tolerate that much tolerance." And the little boy replies, "I refuse to be victimized by notions of virtuous behavior." So again, it comes down to what one person may see as a virtue, another might see as vice. Moving into ethical egoism, it is defined as the pursuit of self-interest as a moral good. What is good for one's own survival and personal happiness is the moral choice. It was originally developed by Henry Sedgwick in 1874, who saw ethical egoism as a personal version of utilitarianism. Adam Smith, who developed the economic philosophy of capitalism, promoted this concept, arguing that pursuing one's own personal good would eventually lead to prosperity for the society as a whole. Criticisms: no recognitions of other people's rights. It violates the basic tenets of an ethical system. And number 3, it supports exploitive actions by the strong against the weak. In the mid-20th century, writer Ayn Rand, she wrote Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, promoted a similar idea to ethical egoism called objectivism, which is defined as the commitment to gaining and maintaining one's own value. For example, while productivity and pride can be seen as virtues, characteristics such as kindness, generosity, and forgiveness are not, because they do not contribute to a person's ultimate value. So we don't care how we can help others, we only care about how we can help ourselves. From this perspective, a person would not risk their life to help someone else. Our only obligation is to ourselves. Much of Ayn Rand's philosophies are aligned with today's libertarian political party, which will be very important when we discuss the Silk Road. Another devotee of Ayn Rand is Paul Ryan, who is currently serving as the Speaker of the House in Congress. So, and he led the way. He was trying to overturn healthcare. He basically provided a framework to cut taxes on the rich. You know, there's this whole ethical egoism that he has perpetuated that really does tend to be the leading issues in the legislative world in the United States. Limitations of ethical egoism, other than, being selfish, personal relationships could not be sustained. If people only focused on their own benefits, there would not be any consideration or cooperation, which are key elements in a personal relationship. Number 2, it would eliminate objective decision making. If personal interest drove every decision, no one would care how others saw them. Number 3, this philosophy requires that everyone follow this path. Everyone must act in their own self-interest. This would require people with deep religious or spiritual feelings to set them aside to focus solely on their own fulfillment. And as much as ethical egoism seems like such a obnoxious perspective to many people, this is a very popular philosophical and political viewpoint these days. And again, what we have to do is look at the larger picture, the macro of, how is this being implemented. Then we move into new natural law, which was developed by John Finnis and Germain Gerzez, based on the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. The first principle: good should be done and evil should be avoided. The imperatives: avoid acting out in hostility, avoid seeking vengeance, never choose evil to achieve a good end. The main criticism of new natural law is that these imperatives are often in direct opposition to the practical and legal issues being addressed. So, for example, the death penalty in the United States is a violation of new natural law. Are we acting out of hostility? Well, we're taking somebody's life. We're acting out of vengeance. Why are we taking their life? To demonstrate that they don't, we're going to take their life in exchange for somebody else's life that they took. And, again, with the death penalty, we're killing someone to achieve a good end. So, and I'm not saying, the death penalty is a terrible thing or it's a great thing. It's just an example I wanted to provide. Then we're moving into situational ethics. And this is probably one of the most new of our ethical frameworks. It was developed by the Reverend Joseph Fletcher in the 20th century. You'll notice I included his title because he came from a religious background, but he saw that there were circumstances that occur that need to sometimes be examined from a broader perspective because there are issues that have not been considered in just a straightforward thou shalt not do this or that. This philosophy states that decision making should be based upon circumstances of a particular situation and not upon fixed law. So the idea here is, let's say that a 14-year-old girl is being molested by her father. One night, when he comes into her bedroom, she stabs him to death. Will she go to jail? Well, in situational ethics, you could say no, because what she did was protect her own self from the evil that was being done to her. Now, if an average 14-year-old goes up to some stranger on the street and stabs them to death, then that is situationally, again, where that person is absolutely responsible for what they did. In Reverend Fletcher's perspective, the only absolute is love. Love should be the motive behind every decision. As long as love is your intention, the end justifies the means. The contradiction of situational ethics is that while Fletcher holds that any commandment may be broken in good conscience if love is one's intention, the Christian Bible states that the keeping of God's commandments is in God. To break any of his commandments, regardless of the intentions, is to not love God. So, therefore, the logic holds that breaking the commandment was not done in love. So, when we get deep into the religious philosophy, it gets very muddy and murky. But if we from a purely secular perspective, this idea of situational ethics is something that most of us do on a regular basis. So now we're going to look at some ethical systems that are specifically related to technology. The perspective is related to whether technology is good for humanity. And they're broken into 4 broad categories. Number 1, technological pessimism. Number 2, technological neutralism. Number 3, technological utopianism. And number 4, technological realism. So our first technological pessimist would be Martin Heidegger. And in his essay, The Question Concerning Technology in 1954, Heidegger asks, what is technology and how do we relate to technology? He answers his first question with 2 fixed ideas. Technology is a means to an end, and technology is a human activity. technology is not just the creation or invention, but also serves as the fundamental mode of revealing the potential of the world. And again, when we look at this kind of situation, we're looking at how all technology, cars, spaceships, the internet, they all reveal more about the world so that then we can explore more and more of the world. In terms of how we relate to technology, he believed the actual problem lies in our orientation to technology, or in other words, how we relate to it. Problems brought about by technology cannot be solved simply by making the technology better. It is also impossible to ignore these difficulties simply by opting out of technology. And ultimately, Heidegger believed that technology is oppressive and dehumanizing. So what he's saying in this conversation is that if we have our identity stolen through the internet, whatever software we put in place is never going to be good enough to protect ourselves, because every time we improve our technology, the people who are stealing our identity are also improving their technology. So ultimately, more technology will never help the technology that's in place. For the people who try to not be involved in technology, it's getting harder and harder. So for example, if you want to book a plane ticket, there might be a travel agency once every 50 miles, but it's so much easier to just go online and do it. You want to look at the times for a movie. It's not in the paper anymore. You have to go look on the internet. So again, all of these things that Heidegger is saying can be perceived as true. It's just not always a negative experience for most of us. But it is dehumanizing. We all sit on our couches hanging out with our family, and we all have our cell phones that we are engaged to, literally in some cases, and we stop really communicating with each other. Jacques Ellul, in his essay The Technological Society, argues that efficiency has become the dominant factor in terms of society's values. He saw technology as a threat to human freedom. Ellul believes that technology shapes the way we live, work, and interact. In other words, he believes that technology has enslaved mankind. And he called technology a tyranny over humanity. There's a picture of him right there with a quote of his: "Modern technology has become a total phenomenon for civilization, the defining force of a new social order in which efficiency is no longer an option, but a necessity imposed on all human activity." You know, the belief was for the longest time that if we use technology properly, we'll make life easy for humans. But now we're in a situation where literally they are talking about passing laws about whether or not employees have to check their email over the weekend. This is a law that's already been passed in France, that employers cannot expect their employees to check their work email when they are off. Max Weber called technology an iron cage to explain how technology locks us into certain patterns of behavior. And again, what we're looking at here is a situation where we are constrained by our addiction to technology, according to Weber. So moving on to the technological neutralists, who argue that technology is a neutral force that is dependent upon humanity's objectives, in other words, what you use it for. Their point is that technology is free from bias. Technology does not promote one type of behavior over another. Technology is ultimately a tool. Technology does not compromise our freedom. Technology does not determine our destiny. And humanity determines if technology is used for good or bad. So a neutralist is basically someone who says The technology in and of itself is not the problem. It's how humans use the technology. And you can say the same thing about vehicles, guns, and everything else that's out there. It's the users who determine what it's used for. Then we have our technological utopianism. They believe that certain technologies can make an ideal world possible with improved lifestyles and workplaces. It assumes that humanity can control technology's negative effects. Assumes that humanity can use technology to improve the human condition. And again, what you could say is, social media has allowed people to reach out and connect with old friends and family members that they don't see regularly. And this would be the perspective of someone with this technological utopianist viewpoint. Technological realism. The belief that technology is a force in its own right, but it is subject to political and social forces. Human behavior is influenced by technology. Technology has changed politics and society. Humans have the power to subdue or redirect the way technology impacts our behavior, politics, and society. And humans control how technology is deployed or restrained. So the idea behind realism is that yes, technology has the power to influence us, but ultimately we have the power over technology. One of the little cartoons that I've put in here, I have to say this one is my favorite. It's the realists. It's the glass that's half full, the glass that's half empty, and then the realist, I think this is P. And the only ones who really know what's going on. So I have to say that's one of my favorites. The point, however, with realism is that this realistic perspective means that we have to educate ourselves on how to manage the technology that we come in contact with. And that, of course, will then lead to how we see the constraints that are placed on technology and in specific the internet. This is Harvard law professor Larry Lessig. He is a proponent of reduced legal constraints on cyber regulations. According to Lessig, there are 4 constraints that regulate our behavior. Number 1, laws. These are rules imposed by the government that are enforced through sanctions. In the real world, we would see speed limits, paying our taxes, that kind of stuff. In the cyber world, we have to respect copyright law. Norms is number 2, and these are the standards that a community considers normal. And in the real world, one of the big norms that we see these days is most people are not smoking cigars in front of their kids. In the cyber world, we avoid spamming our friends. So, we would be unlikely to be the one who sends, "Hey, is your penis large enough?" emails to our buddies unless we know for a fact that they need some help in that area. Number 3, market forces. In other words, supply and demand, the basic economies of how we need and buy things. In the real world, the price of gas goes up in summer because people tend to do more traveling in the summertime. In the cyber world, advertisers tend to gravitate towards the popular sites. So if you go to Facebook, you're going to see advertisements for maybe Honda. If you go to a site that's lesser well known, it might be for a local pizza place. Number 4, codes and architecture. These are constraints that are placed on us either through geography, mountains, or construction, buildings. These constraints are not controlled through coercion. In the real world, buildings usually have windows. in the cyber world, codes that will limit the availability of access by demanding a username and password. So if somebody wants to get into Netflix, they have to have their username and password, or their friend's username and password, depending on their circumstance. So this is kind of an overview of some of the issues we're going to be looking at in terms of the philosophy of ethics, and also some of the legal issues that we're going to be looking at later in the term. But that's it for today. If you have any questions, please text me. Otherwise, if you're not in my class, feel free to leave a comment and I will return and respond as quickly as I can. Have a great day, and make sure you use some sort of cyber protection.